Dawn crawls over the black hills the way an old cat moves across a bar top. Quiet, sure, and giving nothing away. Down in the timbered gulch that men name Deadwood, canvas tents belly in the breeze, and stovepipes breathe thin signatures of smoke. The dirt on Main Street looks wet enough to swallow a boot heel, yet wagon wheels have already gashed it into ruts. Somewhere a piano tries the same three notes and gives up. Somewhere a bottle clacks against another. Somewhere a man clears his throat, spits, and studies the day like a hand he's not sure he wants to play. Up the slope, the pines are black as cut paper, and the wind that combs them smells of sap and rain and something old, older than the road, older than the rush, older than the iron of the stove and the powder in a six-gun. The Lakota call these hills Paha Sapa, a place of ceremony and vision, land the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie set aside for their exclusive use. That word, exclusive, was supposed to be a wall no man could ride through. But gold speaks a language that treaties don't, and by the time the ink was only 8 years dry, riders and footmen, cooks and claim jumpers, drifters and dreamers had found their way into the dark valleys, hungry to sift the creeks and strip the seams. The promise made to the Sioux bent like a sapling in a gale. Then it cracked. 2 summers before this dawn, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer came with the 7th Cavalry and a crowd of civilians, carts creaking, mules balking, reporters sharpening pencils. They camped on French Creek, panned a little gravel, and the whispers started. Gold, right from the grass roots, Custer told the papers, and the phrase sprinted east faster than a courier on a fresh horse. It made fine kindling. Rumors turned to headlines. Headlines to maps drawn in tavern chalk, chalk to boot leather, and boot leather to the sharp new shape of a boomtown. By 1876, Deadwood had grown like a weed in a gap of law, a camp laced together with sawdust floors and false fronts, bright paint over green lumber. It was technically illegal, a town thrown up inside Lakota country where no U.S.-recognized courts reached, no county clerk stamped deeds, and justice, such as it was, came from the weight of your reputation and the friends who would stand behind it. Yet the streets never lacked for customers. There was always a man ready to sell a pick, another ready to buy your claim, a third to pour another inch of brown courage and point you to a faro layout where your luck might jump like a fish. Deadwood was appetite on 2 legs, gold and whiskey, chips and flesh, everything for sale if the price was good enough. A prospector coming in at first light might see the whole story written in the road. A boulder-toothed wagon stalled where the horses had spent themselves, a barrel of flour leaking a white question mark, a slab of moose jerky nailed up under a groceries plank, the colorless wash water pitched into the alley behind a boarding house, and down the way, a painted woman laughing too loud at a joke that wasn't funny. The gulch amplified every sound, the clip of a farrier's hammer, the slap of cards on green baize, the scrape of a chair's leg, and pressed them into the bones of anyone standing still long enough to listen. Some men came for a season and left with pockets heavy and eyes bright. Some left with their boots pointing toward home, and some left too sudden for friends to fold their clothes and pack a shaving kit. Deadwood took what it wanted and gave back a story, if you survived to tell it. No one, not even the newspapers, could agree how many souls swarmed the gulch in those first months. Thousands, certainly, with more rising like a river during the spring melt. A camp could be born between Saturday and Sunday, and by Monday a man would be arguing over who had rights to a square of mud with a lucky trickle running through it. The Black Hills gold rush beggared patience, broke promises, and made reputations overnight. If it made any law, it was the law of speed. Listen close and you can hear the other heartbeat of this place. Hooves in the night, a pick biting quartz, the scrape of a knife against a whetstone, and you can hear what Deadwood tries to ignore, that these hills are not blank ground for fortune to redraw. They are a homeland, mapped not only in creeks and ridges, but in stories and prayers, in the way light lands on a butte and a hawk circles a meadow. The treaty said so. The treaty promised so. But in a town where even the buildings were temporary, a promise could seem as thin as smoke. On a morning like this one, August has settled in with dusty elbows. The cottonwoods on Whitewood Creek sway as if considering the whole enterprise. Somewhere a rooster gets ambitious, then thinks better of it. Men in canvas coats and salt-stiff shirts step around puddles that hold the sky. A coffee pot blisters on a stove. A long tin spoon stirs a pot of beans. Somebody takes a first, cautious sip and swears softly. There's a miner with a bandana tied around his hat brim so it won't blow off on the cliff path. A storekeeper lifting the plank that will become the day's counter. A boy leading a gray mule that wants to argue about everything. Life in Deadwood runs on three fuels: hope, habit, and rumor, and this morning has its share of each. Those who arrive today will have been told the camp is dangerous. They will have been told that the quickest quarrel in Deadwood starts with a look, the second quickest with a card, and the third with a woman. They will be told to wear their money in small packets and to mind the men who mind the doors. They will be told there is a table in Nuttal and Mann's Saloon, where a famous gambler once sat facing the entry, because he liked to see trouble while it was still a rumor. Men remember that kind of habit, even if they don't keep it. Men remember, and then they forget. By midday, the street will be a braid of errands. By dusk, there will be a song, a fight, a wedding, a theft, and a promise to do better tomorrow. The moon will hang like a coin over the ridge, and the pines will capture the wind in their black hands. In the saloons, light will go amber and soft. Men will squint into it, and the felt will be a meadow where fortunes rise and fall, scattered by the dealer's rake. The room at Saloon number 10 is narrow, the rafters low, and the lamp chimneys smudged by a week of smoke. There is a corner chair with a wall at its back. There is another seat that leaves a man's spine open to the door. Those details don't matter, until they do. Beyond Main Street, the hills are close enough to lean on, and the trails slide off toward camps with names that sound like wagers: Gayville, Nevada Gulch, Ruby Basin. Cartridges rattle in a vest pocket, a prayer coin worries the pat of a thumb, and the chapel bell, little more than a borrowed triangle, ticks the late hour. Men who've crossed half a continent to get here talk themselves into sleep. Some dream of gold, some of fences, some of nothing at all. A woman counts tips by lamplight and wraps them in a strip of muslin. A night marshal, whatever that means in a town without proper law, walks past the frame of a new building and touches it for luck. On the far edge of camp, a wolf barks once, as if the hills had a voice and chose to use it. The sound rings down the draw and loses itself among the tents. Deadwood goes on breathing. It will keep breathing until morning pulls it up by the collar again and sets it on its feet. And tomorrow, August 2nd, 1876, a man with a famous name will walk through a saloon door, glance at the corner, and see the chair he wants already taken. He will ask to trade. He will be refused. He will sit where he can, and the room will tilt almost imperceptibly toward the only thing that can't be bargained with. The cards will shuffle, the chatter will rise and fall, the door will open once more, and the hills will say nothing. They keep their own counsel. They always have. Before Deadwood ever knew his tread, the man who would sit down in Saloon number 10 had already stepped into half a dozen lives and shed them like old coats. James Butler Hickok learned early that the frontier remembers a steady gaze. His were a cold gray, quick to weigh a room. He drove stage, scouted for the Union, carried a deputy's papers, and then a lawman star in towns that were more temper than map. When the gun smoke cleared in places like Hayes City and Abilene, folks argued about whether they'd been kept safe or merely kept in awe. Yet even then, a different pistol was making his name: a pen. In the winter of 1867, an Eastern writer met Hickok and carved him into legend in the pages of a fashionable magazine, laying on feet so thick that truth had to squint to keep up. That story, part interview, part invention, pushed a prairie scout onto parlors and breakfast tables back east. From that moment on, Hickok walked with his own shadow at his shoulder, a figure taller than any man could be. The Iron Badge, however, did not come from a magazine. In Kansas, where the cattle trail poured wild money into rough streets, Hickok first served in Hayes City and then, in 1871, took the marshal's job in Abilene, Joseph McCoy's booming railhead, where herds and tempers collided. The pay was steady, the nights weren't. He broke up brawls, disarmed Texans, fresh off the Chisholm Trail, and walked the boardwalk with an easy, dangerous calm. In October, before a crowd pulsing with liquor and grievance, a quarrel with the gambler Phil Coe tore loose. Coe fired, Hickok answered, and Coe went down. In the confusion, a shape rushed toward him. Mike Williams, a friend and fellow officer, and Hickok's reflex caught the wrong man. The shot that dropped Williams would haunt Hickok like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Within weeks, he was out as marshal, less for any single sin than for the way Abilene decided it had had its fill of blood. But if Abilene was the end of one version of Wild Bill, Springfield, Missouri, years earlier, had launched another. In July of 1865, the town square became a makeshift dueling ground when Hickok and gambler Davis Tutt faced off across the dust. One shot each. Tutt fell. It was not the usual press of bodies and pistols. This was two men in a single horizon line, and the story of it ran on rails back east. The tale fixed the notion of a quick-draw showdown in the public imagination and made Hickok's name shorthand for a particular brand of nerve. He was acquitted in court, but convicted to live out the rituals people expected of a legend. From then on, every room he entered filled with rumor a half step before he did. The legend was profitable and exhausting. It wasn't enough for dime novels to print him. The stage wanted him too. For a season in the early 1870s, Hickok tried show business under bright lamps with Buffalo Bill Cody and Texas Jack Omohundro in crowd pleasers like Scouts of the Plains. Critics sharpened their knives. Audiences filled the house anyway, hungry to see the man whose name carried gun smoke. Hickok hated the pretense. He would drift behind scenery, mutter his lines, and sometimes let his temper speak for him with a blank shot skyward when a spotlight burned too hot. By the spring of 1874, he was done with footlights and theater trunks, more tired than famous, and pointed himself back toward the only country where his stride felt honest: the high grass and the gambling tables. And then, unexpectedly, tenderness. In Cheyenne in March of 1876, Hickok married Agnes Thatcher Lake, a widow and the formidable proprietor of a traveling circus. A woman who understood both crowds and payrolls, both the razzle and the grind behind it. The notice in the Cheyenne Daily Leader read simple as a ledger line: married by a minister at a friend's home. If the East liked Hickok as a character, Agnes married the man and didn't blink. He promised to send for her after a short venture in the Black Hills. She promised, one senses, to believe him. They exchanged letters, his at least one, tender to the point of raw, imagining a last shot and her name on his lips. And then their paths forked where the stage of American life has always split love from luck. He joined a freight and express outfit bound for Deadwood. She stayed with the circus, a queen of the Sawdust Trail. On the trail north, he fell in with Charlie Utter, known as Colorado Charlie, whose wagons were painted gaudy as a parade and whose business sense was as sharp as a Skinner's knife. Utter and Hickok had the kind of friendship that flourishes without speeches. Coffee shared before daylight, a quiet word when the cards ran sour, the easy loyalty of men who have traveled the same hard miles. Utter's train carried freighters, fortune seekers, and famous roughs toward a town not yet 2 years old. He would later claim Hickok's body, write the funeral notice for the Black Hills pioneer, and put his friend in the earth on a hill above Deadwood. That future wasn't written yet, for now they were only two men among many, heading into the Black Hills with the smell of pitch in the air, and their pockets hoping for a better answer than the last town had given. By then Hickok's eyes had begun to betray him. Time and trail dust lay heavy on the lids, and the world didn't snap into focus quite as quickly as it used to. Friends noticed him lean forward to read a face, noticed the way he favored the corner seat, where motion could be caught by the edge of vision. Some believed it was trachoma, a sandpaper scourge of the plains. Others made darker guesses. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a fraction's hesitation where there used to be none. A gunfighter's life is tallied in fractions. The law had left his hands, but habit hadn't, and the failing edge of sight left him courting the felt tables more than the streets. Cards were less likely to misunderstand a man. Still, there was a rule he kept as close as a prayer: back to the wall, face to the door. Because a reputation, like an unbroken horse, will try to throw you when you aren't looking. He arrived in the Black Hills not as a conquering hero, but as a working soul with pockets to fill. A famous name walking into a town where most men were known only to their partners and their bartenders. The air of Deadwood tasted different from Kansas. Thinner, resin sweet, impatient. The legal borders were different too. less a line on a map than a fog that rolled in and out with each new load of ore. Hickok must have felt the tilt, the way a man could be lionized at breakfast and growl stared at by supper, the way a story could buy you a drink in one saloon and an argument in the next. Yet he was at ease where other men tightened. He knew the rights of a mining camp, how to study a faro dealer's eyelids, how to hear false bravado in a chuckle, how to make a small stake last and then double it with patience instead of passion. He knew above all how to enter a room as if the room didn't own him. There was another truth he carried with him like a bruise. The distance between the man and the legend narrows whenever a stranger wants to test the difference. That knowledge made him courteous, even soft-spoken, until it didn't. He was as likely to help a loser eat breakfast as he was to turn a bully into a cautionary tale. He shook hands with prospectors, traded quips with dance hall girls, and chose his words the way a careful player antes. Just enough to stay in, with a little extra on top when the company was good. The man behind the legend, like most men, was a mix of good intentions and bad hours. 3/4 decent and 1/4 ready. By late July of 1876, his days developed their own frontier rhythm. A walk in the cool of morning when the gulch still smelled like rain. A visit with Utter, or a stop at a barber's chair for a trim to keep the sweat out of his eyes. Cards when the lamps were lit. He was not flush. The Black Hills had yet to turn friendly, but he was not destitute either. His luck, like the town itself, was provisional. All the while, story trailed him. The duel in Springfield, the long badge years, the night in Abilene, like the echo of boots down a hallway. Wild Bill was on the far edge of his fame, a man neither arriving nor fading, only continuing, which is the truest work anyone does. And then came the small, ordinary decisions that make a hinge of a day. Which saloon, which table, which seat. In Kansas, he had collected a set of laws that were not written, but were no less binding. And the first of them was this: keep your eyes front and your back guarded by something that won't move. Every gambler keeps a superstition. Every gunman keeps a rule. Hickok's superstition was probably luck. His rule was certainly the wall. Soon enough, he would have to choose between them. For now, Deadwood drew a long breath. The doorways of the gulch were black mouths waiting to see what a man would say. The town had met him. It had not yet measured him. That would come with the turn of the next card, the scrape of a chair, the hush that falls when a room senses the hour. It is the simplest arithmetic the frontier knows. A man plus a moment. It is also the most unforgiving. The lamps in Nuttal and Mann's Saloon No. 10 breathed their own weather. Thin halos of light trembling in smoky air, glass chimneys smudged the brown of old tea. Sawdust took the day's spittle and the day's secrets. A faro layout in the corner murmured its own crooked lullaby, while the piano, octaves missing like teeth in a miner's smile, stumbled through a tune everyone pretended to recognize. Men kept their voices low, gambling not to be heard. In that room, the felt was a meadow and the dealer a quiet reaper. The rake glided and fortune shrank to the width of a hand. When Hickok came in, the talk stretched and thinned, then knitted itself again. He wore ease like a coat. No swagger, no theater, only that soft, steady look that measured the room and filed what it found. He drifted past the bar's mirror, where lamplight stacked itself in duplicates, and took the table that had been good to him before. 5-card draw tonight, not faro. The corner chair, the one backed by 2 stout boards and a nail head you could count with your shoulder, was already occupied. The man sitting there pretended not to notice. Hickok asked to trade. Quiet, courteous, the kind of request a man honors in a town where enemies are cheap. The player in the corner shook his head once. Hickok tried a second time. The same words, only gentler. Another refusal, a shrug shaped like a small dare. So Hickok took what the room would give him, a side chair with nothing at his back but air and the door's black mouth. He set himself with a gambler's calm and arranged his chips as if putting a room in order. Cards whispered across the felt. Names were nothing here. Men were their breaths and their bets. Hickok's fingers handled the pasteboards lightly, like a thing already known. No one at the table talked about the day before, but the room knew. A fellow called Jack McCall, sometimes Bill Sutherland, when he liked the sound of it better, had lost heavily at this very table. Hickok had gathered his chips, read the ruin in the other man's face, and slid a few coins across that weren't part of any pot. "For breakfast," he said, "and quit till you can afford not to lose." Advice is a kind of mercy that can sound like a sneer when a man's pride is limping. Some said McCall thanked him. Some said he took the charity like a slap. Either way, the coin was spent by morning. What remained had teeth. Outside, horses shuffled against hitch rails, itching under flies. Inside, the dealer turned up a jack to start the draw, and chairs sighed against planks as men settled their balances with the uncanny care of those who have learned to live in rooms where you never want to stand too fast. A bottle made its rounds. Hickok let the table do its work. Call, raise, fold. A rhythm as old as temptation. Someone coughed a coal miner's cough. Someone else laughed 2 notes too high and left it stranded there. McCall perhaps had been looking for his nerve in a glass. He'd certainly been looking for something. Witnesses later disagreed on what he'd drunk and when, the way witnesses always do when a single moment makes all other details suddenly important. But this much the evening remembered. A figure moved from the bar to the back of the room, paused in a shallow pocket of shadow near the door, then turned toward Hickok's exposed shoulder, as if obedience to a mean idea had finally come due. The pistol he carried spoke the common language of the plains, a hefty horse of a revolver, the kind you could trust to bite through distance and bone. Play slowed without stopping. Hickok leaned to watch the draw, and the men around the felt watched one another watch it. He had already shown a small hand and folded. Now he was back in, chips arranged like low hills in front of his left wrist. Legend will later invent its own geometry for this instant. The black aces and the black eights tilted toward the lamplight, the odd 5th card face down like a secret. But the truth of a crowded room is this. Very few men are watching the cards in another man's hand when the air changes. What they notice first is temperature, or the way sound knots in the throat of the door. McCall came up behind him from the left, angled so he could see the profile of that famous face. He didn't ask. He didn't warn. He said 2 words the room would remember in fragments. "Take that!" and fired point blank into the back of Wild Bill Hickok's head. The report took a slice out of the air. Glass leapt from a lamp. A woman yelped and made it sound like a laugh. The bullet tore forward through skull and gray, blew out at the right cheekbone in a red coin of ruin, and had life enough left to bury itself in the left wrist of Captain William Massey, seated opposite, who had reached to gather his own cards and found pain instead. The bottle tipped, the lamp chimed. The cards in Hickok's hand slid apart like geese startled from a pond and drifted toward the floor. The noise that follows a shot indoors is not what a plainsman expects. It's smaller and meaner, all teeth and corners. For a half-breath, there was silence, the kind that blows the flame out of a room. Then the saloon sounds fell back in, all at once and wrong-sized. A chair going over, the rattle of a chip rack, somebody saying Jesus like it was a first name they just learned. Hickok didn't move. The famous back was a dead man's back now. Notched to the chair, his chin slumped to his shirt front as if he'd fallen into a sudden, sick sleep. Men don't act like themselves in the first moments after a gun goes off and makes myth into work. One player kept staring at his own hand, as if the cards could still be made to tell a better story. Another crawled under the table, as if his legs had decided for him. The dealer's eyes went large and wet and stayed that way for the rest of his life. A man with a minister's beard reached for Hickok's shoulder and then drew his hand back without touching, like a boy who's been warned away from a stove. McCall's flight started like a joke with bad timing. He shoved back from the table, kicked a chair leg, and made for the rear. The room couldn't tell yet if it was going to be brave tonight. Bravery is a thing that arrives in pockets. A miner near the back wall stuck out a boot and did what he could. McCall stumbled, barked his shin on a spittoon, and burst into the alley. The saloon exhaled, as if his leaving had given it permission to breathe again. Then half of Deadwood tried to fit through the same door. In the alley, the night smelled of stale beer and horse sweat. McCall grabbed at a saddle he hadn't checked, threw himself up, and came right back down in a confusion of stirrup and cuss. The cinch had slipped. The horse shied sideways, deeply offended. The men who had followed, drunk, angry, newly awake, piled onto him in a knot of elbows and oaths and hauled him up by his collar like a wet dog. He was marched back through the doorway he'd just broken, and the room received him with a sound that had memo in it. a promise that there would be a reckoning tonight, even if no one could yet name the court that would hold it. Back at the table, Captain Massey sat white to the lips, pressing his left wrist with his right hand, as if he could squeeze the bullet back the way it had come. Blood threaded his cuff and pattered onto the felt. Somebody tore a sleeve to make a bandage and tied it with a ferryboat man's knot. Someone else pulled a coat from a peg to wrap around Hickok's shoulders, a courtesy the dead do not feel but the living need to perform. The cards nearest his fingers had picked up their own dark grammar, stained in a manner to make men talk foolish for years. Some said they saw black aces and black eights. Some said no one saw a thing except the end of a famous man. The truth, hard and unbeautiful, was that memory had made itself a gambler too and would stack the deck later. "Get Doc," someone barked, but the room knew it was theater. In a world where time is counted in fractions, the fraction had already been spent. A saloon girl crossed herself the way she'd seen in New Orleans, quick as a bird's wing. The dealer lifted the deck and set it down, then lifted it again, a man trying to decide whether the world had changed. The piano kept its silence. McCall, pinned to a post by men whose knuckles were already purple, worked his mouth like a man trying to chew a story into shape. He said something about a brother dead in Kansas, about justice paid for late, words that would earn him a few hours' mercy in 2 months' delay, and then a rope. But the room didn't know that yet. The room only knew that a line had been crossed between fear and fact, and there was no way back across except through law or rage. Deadwood was new at law. Rage it could manage. They bound McCall with a length of clothesline and a belt for good measure, and marched him into the street, where a dozen men became 2 dozen, and the air felt as if a storm were pressing against the town from the inside. Behind them, someone righted a chair. Someone swept the fallen cards into a small, guilty pile, as if neatness could mend what had split. Someone laid his palm on the back of the corner chair, the safe chair, the wall chair, as if it had been a talisman that failed and needed forgiving. Above the rooftops, the pines kept their counsel. The hills listened and said nothing. In the narrow space between smoke and lamp, between oath and prayer, the town prepared to improvise a courthouse out of anger and boards, because the law was somewhere far away, and this was a place where men settled debts with what they had on hand. Before midnight, a jury would be chosen by applause. An argument will be baptized as testimony, and a verdict will be found that cannot hold its shape in daylight. But for now the room held a man who was no longer among the living, and a man who feared he soon wouldn't be. And between them, sideways on the felt, the scattered language of chance. The door breathed as men went in and out carrying versions of the story. Hickok's habit, back to the wall, would be told and retold as if it were a verse from Scripture, a sermon delivered too late. The chair would become a relic, the way a common thing turns holy when touched at the right instant. And somewhere on the edge of town, a coyote would let go a sound like the slow tearing of cloth, and the gulch would answer with echo, and Deadwood would not sleep, not properly, not for a long time. The deck would be cut again, but the game had changed. The house rules had changed. The town itself had changed, as towns do when legend and evidence collide, and neither wins. In the morning there would be a trial of sorts and a verdict of sorts, and then the larger law would arrive to say what counted and what did not, and why. But this night belongs to the saloon in the alley and the chair that was 1 seat from safety. It belongs to a single bullet moving faster than regret. It belongs to a room full of men who learned, in a breath, that the past you carry like a talisman is not a shield, only a story you tell yourself until a louder story speaks. Outside, the wind pressed a signboard against its chain. Inside, the lamp's flame steadied, stubborn as a witness. Somewhere between them lay the simple hinge of the thing, a man and a moment, and the door between them. By midnight, Deadwood had made itself into a courthouse because it did not have one to borrow. The crowd surged toward McDaniel's Theater, a plank and canvas playhouse that, like everything else in town, could be repurposed if the need was loud enough. Tonight, the stage was justice. Miners shouldered in with candles guttering on saucers. Storekeepers came with ledgers tucked under their arms, as if truth might be a matter of arithmetic. A handful of gamblers filed in quiet as parishioners. Someone found a plank for a table. Someone else rapped a pick handle like a gavel until the room remembered to hush. A jury was named by the ancient method of frontier democracies. A few men proposed, a few more shouted yes, and those chosen took their seats with the uneasy pride of bystanders, suddenly responsible for the temperature of a town. They brought Jack McCall up through the footlights, into that yellow stage glow that makes every face look like it knows a secret. He had slept hardly at all and wore the haggard mask of a man whose story was trying to outrun his facts. The first questions came at him like thrown stones. Why, how, who told you to? But then the room discovered, as rooms do, that explanation is slower than anger. Witnesses stood to say what they had seen. A figure moving from the door, a pistol lifted, a bang that clipped the world in half. Testimony turned slippery the instant it was spoken. The saloon girl was sure McCall had been at the bar just before the shot. A miner swore he'd seen him loitering near the door for 5 minutes. A man who'd been drinking gave 2 answers and then confessed he couldn't tell which belonged to him. When it was McCall's turn to arrange his words, he took the room by the throat with one claim. Hickok had killed his brother in Kansas, he said. Abilene, he thought, and the deed in Saloon number 10 was not murder, but a late-delivered justice. You could feel the theater lean forward. Revenge is a story the frontier knows how to hear. It fits into the old grooves. But names could not be produced. No brother could be found among Kansas graves who matched the tale, and some swore McCall had never said brother until that very hour. The defense clung to the claim anyway. In a court built of boards and breath, the shape of a story can be as persuasive as the spine of a statue. Outside, rain ticked on the theater canvas and dripped from its seams. Inside, the miners' court performed the ritual it understood. Witnesses, questions, a jury that withdrew for the time it took to smoke a cigarette and consider how a verdict would sound carried down Main Street. 2 hours from gavel to gavel, they returned with an acquittal, not guilty. A breath went through the crowd, half relief and half argument. A few men who had favored a rope without bother for law scowled and said the town had lost its nerve. Others nodded, satisfied that whatever else Deadwood lacked, it had proved it could decide. The prisoner was released with instructions to leave camp. The verdict tacked itself to the town like a notice flapping loose on a door. Official, visible, not quite secure. At dawn, Charlie Utter saw to his friend. Deadwood climbed the hill above town and put James Butler Hickok into the earth with a kind of frontier ceremony that cannot pretend to gentility and therefore carries its own clean weight. Men hat in hand, boots scuffing, prayer spoken plain. A newspaper notice would be printed with care enough to make even a rough hand steady. On that hill, the story acquired its first stillness. Down in the gulch, the story began to move again. McCall drifted west. He carried his acquittal like a talisman and his temper like a coal he meant to keep. In saloons across Wyoming, he told and retold how he had shot the famous Wild Bill, how he had evened an old account, how Deadwood had nodded and said, fair. Bragging is a poor disguise. It hangs wrong on the frame. Somewhere between whiskey glass and winter wind, a U.S. Marshal put a hand on McCall's shoulder and read him a different future. The route led east, not back to Deadwood, to Yankton, capital of Dakota Territory, where an actual court could pronounce an actual law. The miners' court was smoke and noise. This would be statute and seal. The case turned on a question larger than the man in irons. What counted as a trial in a place that had no legal right to one? Deadwood sat, then, on Lakota land promised by treaty, outside any organized county or territorial jurisdiction. Its proceedings could quiet a street, but they could not satisfy the United States. The lawyers preparing the new case sharpened their knives on that point. Double jeopardy? Not here, they argued, because the first proceeding had no lawful jurisdiction. You cannot be tried twice for the same crime if you were not tried once by a court that existed in the eyes of the law. To men who had just watched a jury of neighbors free a killer, this sounded like sleight of hand. To the territorial court, it sounded like bedrock. By December 1876, winter pressed its face to Yankton's windows. The territorial courtroom smelled of damp wool and ink. Here there were proper chairs and a clerk who stacked papers with the pomp of a man who trusts paper more than people. McCall looked smaller without the theater lights. Witnesses arrived from Deadwood and beyond. Men who had been in the saloon, men who had hauled the prisoner out of the alley, men who had wrapped Captain William Massey's bleeding wrist, Men whose voices still trembled at the memory of how quickly a famous life can be converted to work for undertakers. The story was told again, cleanly now, without the urgency of a mob. The defense tried to fit its old tool to a new lock. A brother, a killing in Kansas, a revenge long in the making. But Abilene brought no record of such a brother, and the tale crumpled when held up to winter light. McCall's bravado, those saloon boasts he could not keep to himself, now worked like a confession. The jury studied him the way men study an unbroken horse, weighing spirit against sense. In a town built to administer law, the verdict took less drama and more time than Deadwood's had, as if care itself were a kind of ceremony. The finding, guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. Between verdict and execution, McCall sat in a cell with winter in the seams of it. Chaplains came and went, words offered and sometimes received. The condemned made small claims to courage, the way men do when they must persuade themselves to walk toward a platform they do not wish to climb. Outside, Yankton went about its business, woodpiles shrinking, sleighs dragging lines on packed snow, a newspaper composing the sober language that turns a man's end into a column inches fact. March 1st, 1877. The scaffold stood plain as a rule at the edge of town. A few officials, a few citizens, an air of order so unlike the murk of Deadwood's theater night. McCall mounted with the solemn clumsiness of one taking a last, reluctant stage. If he was brave, it was not the large kind. It was the small, shabby courage of a man who senses that the world is at last done listening to him. Words were spoken that nobody will quote well later. A hood, a rope, then a sound like a door closing from the far end of a hallway. The first legal execution by U.S. authority in Dakota Territory had been carried out. What Deadwood could not do with miners' justice, Yankton concluded with jurisdiction and a ledger line. Back in the Black Hills, the news arrived on the same trail as flour and letters. Men in saloons read it aloud and nodded to themselves as if the arithmetic finally added up. Some insisted the Deadwood verdict had been right for the hour. Others said it had been cowardice dressed as mercy. Either way, the matter had passed into the books and would not be retrieved. The miners' court, like a campfire, had thrown heat and light and then gone to ash. The territorial court had been winter, deliberate and final. What did it prove? That on a frontier where treaty and greed had made a tangle, the law would eventually pick its way through and claim a ground to stand on. That a town may improvise order, but only a government can stamp a seal and say, this counts. The Deadwood, born out of speed and appetite, still had to answer to a statute written far away. The paradox remained: a boom town thriving on land promised to the Lakota by solemn agreement, a killer acquitted by a court that did not legally exist, a second court, distant, sober, and slow, asserting the United States' reach into a gulch that had imagined itself beyond reach. On the hill above Deadwood, spring would loosen the ground at Mount Moriah, and the grass would find its way between stones. Visitors would climb to see Hickok's marker and leave playing cards as if tribute could change the rules of a game already dealt. In the saloons, the story grew useful. Dealers told it to fresh arrivals as a tutorial in how quickly fortune can go sour. Lawmen told it as proof that even the famous must keep their rules. The pious told it as a parable. And around the poker tables, the myth hardened like cooled iron. Aces and eights, the dead man's hand, because a detail, true or not, can carry more weight than a verdict. In Deadwood, you could still see the stage where a town had tried to be a nation for 2 hours and found itself unequal to the job. In Yankton, you could consult a docket where a man's end was recorded without poetry. Between them lay the frontier's education, the slow discovery that order is not the absence of chaos, but the argued management of it. By then, Wild Bill had been dead half a year. McCall had followed. The theater was back to comedy, the court back to contracts. Yet the silence that fell in Saloon number 10 at the instant of that shot had found its echo. The law's unhurried answer. The two sounds belong to each other. One is the wound. The other is the scar. When men speak of aces and eights, their voices lower without deciding to. It is a small ceremony performed for a story that has outlived the men who first carried it. The tale says Wild Bill Hickok died with 2 black aces and 2 black eights fanned in his left hand and 1 stray card, identity disputed, near the edge of the felt. The image is so clean you can feel the linen finish of the pasteboard and smell the lamp oil. 4 dark pips like fly specks of doom, as if the deck itself had written a verdict. But the truth inside all that tidiness is more uncertain than the legend likes to admit. No contemporaneous account lists Hickok's exact hand. The newspapers that described his death with the cool arithmetic of a coroner kept the cards out of their columns. The combination that would become famous, black aces and black eights, was most widely popularized decades later in 1926, when a biographer sanded the story to a smooth, unforgettable shape. By then, the nation already preferred its frontier memories laminated. If this disappoints, take heart. Most myths worth keeping begin with a small, usable truth and then grow the way antlers do. Branching, polishing, locking in combat with doubt. The small truth is simple. Hickok was shot mid-game. Cards fell from his hand. The room remembered the shock better than the pips. The part that antlered is the combination. For years, old-timers traded versions. Some swore the 5th card was a queen of hearts. Others argued a 9. Some said there was no time for a 5th at all. What few admit is that in a room thick with smoke and astonishment, men's eyes do not work like a camera. Memory is a gambler. It stacks the deck later. Yet why did aces and eights win the pot of public memory when other arrangements were in the hat? Partly because the cards themselves carried a poetry that fit the moment. Aces for the high, fatal standing of a famous man. Eights low enough to suggest the ordinary day he died on. And the black suits, spades and clubs, matching the color minds choose for funerals even when the coffin is pine and the sky is cruelly blue. The West understood symbols. It wore them on hats and saddles and boots, carved them into rifle stocks, stitched them into company flags. It made sense that a death would choose its own emblem, and that the emblem would be something a man could touch. It also mattered what kind of game was on the table. Pharaoh might have been the king of the frontier, swift as rumor and bent nearly as often, but 5-card draw had the better knack for drama. Draw is a private conversation between a man and himself. Keep 3, replace 2, gamble on nerve. Aces and eights suits a draw hand. It lies there like a riddle, promising strength and threatening ruin if the next man holds better. The image of Hickok cradling such a hand presses every button the story needs. Calculated risk, a breath of luck, a moment poised between triumph and the kind of finish the plains are good at supplying. Before the hand became the hand, the phrase "dead man's hand" wandered American speech like a camp dog, turning up in far-flung saloons and newspapers, sometimes meaning one ominous arrangement, sometimes another, sometimes only the unlucky feeling that rides home with a man who has seen too much. Words drift out here the way men do, losing and finding names. It took time, and the nation's hunger for crisp legends, to weld Dead Man's Hand to Hickok's last hour, and to print that union until it could pass for genealogy. You can watch the union harden if you follow the paper trail into the new century. Histories written at a comfortable remove, reminiscences that remember more with each telling, plays, posters, pulp magazines. The story simplifies as it travels, like a river that drops silt until only the channel remains. Aces and eights. Black. A 5th card face down, just enough mystery left in the picture to make a man lean closer. The public likes a riddle it can memorize. The West, for all its dust and confusion, becomes easier to carry when reduced to a handful of tokens. A Colt, a Stetson, a tin star, and a quartet of cards a boy can learn to fear before he knows the odds. There's another reason the symbol stuck. Poker is American scripture, written on pasteboard in rooms where men decide who deserves what by taking each other's measure. The 19th century used poker the way a preacher uses a parable, as a language for doubt and faith in the kind of honesty that is born, paradoxically, in a place where bluff is expected. Aces and eights became a parable, a sermon preached under low lights. Watch your back, read the room, do not let pride borrow what it cannot repay. When lawmen stitched the motif onto unit patches or carved it into grips, when clubs and regiments adopted it, when some later biker jackets borrowed it for their emblems, they were reaching for a compact that promised not luck but alertness, a reminder to face the door even if you must sit where the room tells you. Of course, gamblers are not priests, and symbols do not stay pious for long. In saloons from Leadville to Tonopah, the sight of aces and eights on the layout could prompt a crooked smile, a mutter about Bill's last hand, and a superstitious twitch in the fingers. Men who scoffed at omens still felt the skin on their necks stir when the combination tumbled out of the deck. The bravest thing at a card table is to keep your breathing even when the room tries to make sense of you. The wisest thing is to ignore a ghost's advice. Most manage one or the other, not both. Walk up to Mount Moriah Cemetery today, and you'll see how the myth goes on working. Visitors leave playing cards at Hickok's grave as if the deck can be bribed or the dead amused. The cards grow soft under weather, collapse into a sodden confession, and are replaced by newer ones, crisp as intentions. Children are told the shorthand, aces and eights, and hold the phrase the way you hold a smooth rock from a creek, thumb rubbing it for luck. Guides tell the long version in a voice trained to keep pace with footfalls. It is a good story to tell among pines. The wind approves of stories that know when to pause. Does it matter finally whether the exact pips are historically proved? For scholars, yes, footnotes are a kind of honor. For the country that adopted Hickok as an emblem of a certain frontier nerve, perhaps it matters in a different register. We choose a shape for our memories, not only to remember, but to instruct. Aces and eights survive because it teaches neatly. The rule you break, back to the wall, is the one that undoes you. The kindness you offer, coins for a loser's breakfast, may buy you someone else's grievance. The luck you rely on will sit down with you and then stand up with the rest of the room when trouble enters behind your shoulder. The hand became a proverb. Look close at the 4 black pips, though, and you can see the edges of a harder lesson. Legends are not lies. They are curated truths, sanded until the splinters won't snag a passing sleeve. Hickok's life resists sanding. A lawman who made mistakes, a gentleman who carried steel, a performer who disliked performance, a husband who left for a stake he never found. The cards fix him at one table on one afternoon and make the world tidy for a heartbeat. But the larger story, the broken treaty under his boots, the improvised courts, the winter gallows in Yankton, refuses to fit entirely inside 4 cards and a rumor. That is why the symbol works. It points beyond itself, black and spare, toward a country learning the price of its appetites. Still, a symbol wants a scene, and the scene keeps returning. Lamplight like amber, men leaning forward, a soft riffle, the delicate way a thumb lifts the corner of a card, as if tenderness could coax pips to become something else. In the hush before the gun cracks, Hickok might have been studying either his cards or the room. We cannot know which. The myth picks the cards because that is the way to make the world feel fair. A man dies holding the thing that named him. The history less generous leaves his gaze ambiguous, searching for movement at the edge of failing sight. Between those two versions, parable and ledger, aces and eights keeps its balance, useful as a talisman, honest as a warning. And so the story endures in the places where Americans continue to gamble, on cards, on fortunes, on the future bending their way. Dealers still lift a deck and feel for its center. Players still cut without looking down. Old-timers still tell the greenhorns not to sit with their backs naked to a door. Someone somewhere redeals a game while the piano in the corner tries a tune and fails and then tries again. When the 4 black pips fall together, even a skeptic's hand tightens on his glass. He will call it superstition and play on. He will be right. He will also be playing with a country's oldest habit, turning a life into a lesson and a lesson into a hand that can be learned, carried, and quietly feared. Climb the switchback path above Deadwood and the wind changes its manners. Down in the gulch it bargained. Up here it speaks in a cleaner tongue, combing the pines until they shine dark as whetstone. The graves at Mount Moriah look east as if the dead were waiting for first light to call their names. There are flags and tin tokens, glass pebbles and coins, a rosary's broken loop, and, often as not, a playing card softened by rain until the pips run like ink. The ground holds 2 stories side by side that the town has braided into one. James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok, moved here in 1879 from his first resting place, and Martha Canary, whom the world called Calamity Jane, set down beside him in 1903 at her own request. The granite does not argue, it lets the living do that. About Jane, the stories flare and fade like matches in wind. She could ride astride a problem and make it throw its head. She could also drink herself into the kind of late-night pity that burns friends as collateral. She claimed loudly when she needed the attention, softly when she needed the comfort, that she and Hickok had been bound to each other in a way that outlasted the tense and the seasons. No paper proves it. No preacher's line, no courthouse scrawl, no letter from him that addresses her as anything but a fellow traveler in a hard country. What we have instead is the simple fact of proximity and death, a choice made by the town and the times and the woman herself, who understood as well as any showman that position is a kind of narrative. Laid side by side, the two graves offer the kind of neatness the living crave. History, less accommodating, shrugs and declines to certify the romance. The truth might be duller or kinder than legend allows. They knew each other. Yes, they crossed paths. He nodded to her in a street where horses steamed like kettles. She told and retold the tale until the telling was the point. The ache beneath the stone is Hickok's quiet second journey, re-interment, from the raw, early cemetery at Ingleside to this hill with a view, a move that acknowledged both the swelling traffic of mourners and the economy of memory. Deadwood had learned fast how to make a relic pay its keep. Souvenir hunters chipped at his first monument until it looked moth-eaten. Fences were raised not to protect the dead so much as to restrain the appetite of the living. Up here, the afternoon light launders the stone to a pale virtue, and the pines talk in their sleep. The town below remade its face more than once. The fires of 1879 ate streets like ribbon and forced a more formal grid upon the place. New money hammered up brick where pine had been, and yet the hill stayed the hill, presiding without pomposity, counting years by the way lichen writes its patient script across a name. If you listen above the grass, you can hear other footfalls sharing the ridge. Prospectors and barkeeps turned respectable under the pressure of mortgages. Lakota elders saying prayers that a treaty's torn page could not erase. Children who have been told to keep their voices down and cannot. The broken promise of Fort Laramie, 1868, still bends the air in these parts. That treaty named the Black Hills for exclusive Sioux use, and the word exclusive should have been iron. Instead, it became tin rattling on a string, drowned by the shout of 1874 gold and the rush that followed. Hickok's death lives inside that geography of taking. A celebrity killing in a saloon that stood on land paper, said was not the nation's to use. When Deadwood tells its story with romance and rope, the treaty stands in the doorway, unsmiling, reminding the town that law and appetite are not synonyms. The Lakota word for these hills did not go mute when the assays came back bright. So what does the dead man's hand mean up here? With a breeze on your face and the town talking itself hoarse below? A warning, perhaps, about the economy of reputation. Hickok carried a legend that preceded and followed him like the sound of his own spurs. It bought him drinks and grudges in equal measure. It brought strangers to his table eager to sit close to a story, and others drawn by the old sour desire to test a name. He knew enough to sit with his back to the wall until the day he did not. And yet to pin his death upon a single broken habit is to seed the ground with a moral too tidy for the size of the place. If a man can live by rules, the frontier will live by exceptions. A chair is only a chair until someone stands behind it. The McCall case, Deadwood's makeshift absolution and Yankton's cold correction, cast a long, instructive shadow. It taught the Black Hills that speed and sincerity are not the same thing as jurisdiction, that a verdict is less an emotion than a venue and a seal, and that a town's first answer is not always its best one. You could argue that the hanging of a single drifter changed little in the arithmetic of a region powered by ore and ambition. But law is conservative by design. It celebrates increments. The rope at Yankton drew a line that the miners' court could not, and from that line the territory could begin to pretend it was a state in training rather than a weather front of men in need. Meanwhile, Deadwood learned other languages. Hearst money, shipped up from Lead in the steely loops of a new century, taught the Gulch to spend like a banker and to save like one too. Boardwalks widened, eaves sharpened, civic pride put on a collar. The town grew a courthouse with a center of gravity. Then, like a place with a flair for second acts, it grew into tourism, and later into legal gaming, polishing its rough beginnings into a kind of velvet history visitors could touch without getting splinters. The signs painted in gold leaf on glass, the recreated saloons, the mule-drawn tours, the neat little museums where pistols sleep behind glass, all of it a way to domesticate a mess without lying outright about it. You can forgive a town its compromises when it tells you plainly what it is selling, story, and a chance to walk inside it for an afternoon. What doesn't polish, not entirely, is the Lakota claim. A hill can host several truths at once, and these do not always behave. Walk the ridge at dusk, and the pines speak both of ceremonies that predate any deed book and of boomtown prayers whispered by men who couldn't spell the word but meant it. The ache of that dual memory keeps the air truthful. It reminds the listener that the West's most durable myths of brave men and clean motives float atop a deeper water of dispossession and hunger. That tension gives the story its voltage. Remove it and the tale collapses into a postcard. Hickok's grave pulls a steady thread of pilgrims. Motorcyclists in leather who idle respectfully as if the gravel were church aisles. Retirees with guidebooks and a precise budget of attention. Kids who have never held a real deck and hold a plastic one now with the seriousness of novices. Some stand with heads bare and speak aloud to the stone. Some crack jokes to keep the heat off the back of their necks. A few read the small print and let the silence do its work. If you tarry, the day arranges them into a parable about legacy. How much of a life the world will keep, how much it will throw away, and how much it will make up, because making up feels like honoring when done with the right measure of tenderness. And Jane, her stone flowers with offerings stranger than cards, a small flask, a braid of horsehair, a photograph browned at the edges. Visitors, especially those who trust disorder more than etiquette, find in her a comrade who understood the cost of going loud through a polite world. Whether or not Hickok loved her is finally a question the stones decline to answer. She loved the notion that he did, and that love still pays its way at the gate, buying a little more oxygen for both graves. You can judge that, or you can recognize in it the West's old talent for turning want into litany. Look down from the hill and the town looks manageable, almost toy small in its bowl of green. Saloons glow, doors swing, money changes hands with that wry efficiency the hills teach. Somewhere a dealer cuts a deck and for a second feels the weight of 4 cards that do not exist, not in a way a ledger could certify. He shuffles on. Somewhere a ranger pins on a badge stitched with aces and eights and tells himself it's not superstition, only a reminder to check the door, check the corners, check his temper. Somewhere a scholar clicks shut a laptop after a day's argument with footnotes, satisfied that the hand cannot be proved, but the story can be told responsibly. The country in this small way goes on. What remains? A town that learned to be a textbook without turning into a museum, a grave that invites pilgrimage and debate, a woman laid beside a man to whom she was attached by hope if not by record, a treaty that remembers itself even when the papers folded away, and a hand all black pips and rumor that still draws a long breath from a room when it flutters out of a deck as if born again. Legends are not obligations. They are invitations to look harder, to argue better, to keep a weather eye on the door. If you were to stand by Hickok's stone at last light and let the wind climb your sleeves, you might ask yourself the old necessary question, in a place where luck, law, and reputation sit at the same table, which one would you trust when the door opens behind you? The hills will not answer. They will only hold the silence steady until you fill it with your own.